We have 3 theories of evolution that we are going to discuss today. We will be looking at Lamarckism. Then we will also be looking at something called punctuated equilibrium, and then Darwin's theory about natural selection. And then after looking at these 3 theories, we'll then also discuss speciation. So these are, if we sort of unpack these, I'm going to give you a few sort of like rhymes or a framework that you can use to answer your questions. So yeah, by using these frameworks, you can then answer you can apply it to any example that they give you in an examination. So the questions about Lamarckism, Darwin and natural selection, and even speciation, if you sort of follow the basic framework and then apply it to the situation, you'll be able to get maximum marks. So we're going to start off by looking at Lamarckism. So Lamarck was like a French naturalist, and he basically proposed that species evolve throughout their course of Earth's history, and he noticed that animals are quite well suited to the environment, and he suspected that through their lifetime they just basically improve themselves. I just want to get this video to play. Anyways, so he basically suspected that animals basically just improve themselves throughout their lifetime, and the example that you might have looked at in your textbook is that the giraffes with the giraffe's neck, and then throughout sort of their necks just become, they stretch them a lot and their necks become longer and longer, and that is because they want to get to the leaves that are higher on the trees. So he thought that these changes are because the animals just struggle to survive, and he proposed these 2 laws. So these are his laws. The law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So that is a law that you need to remember. And this means that these features that the animals acquire throughout their life are passed on to their offspring. So whatever they acquire themselves, if they themselves give themselves a longer neck, that feature will be passed on to their offspring. And then the second law is the law of use and disuse. So this means that when an organism uses one organ a lot, for example, the giraffes stretching their necks a lot, they are using that a lot, and more regularly, then it will become more developed, or in this case, it will become more longer. And then the same thing with the disuse. If an organism then doesn't use something a lot, like an organ, then it will become less developed and even maybe smaller, and it may even disappear altogether. So you'll notice that we've put the word law in brackets, or in these sort of marks, and that is because it's not an actual law. So Lamarck's 2 laws were actually criticized a lot, and they were proven as incorrect and disproved. So that's why we refer them to as laws, but they're not like really laws in the sense that we speak about laws. So you would say that the giraffes would stretch and stretch their necks, and then through reproduction, that long neck will then be passed on to their offspring. So if we look at the basic framework of how Lamarck would see evolution, Lamarck saw evolution as follows, and this is the framework that you can use and then apply to a given example. And we'll look at an example and how to apply this framework. So firstly, he'll say that there's no variation. Everyone at the start basically just looks the same. At the start, with the giraffe example, all of them, they had short necks. Then you have to tell me, what do you mean with there's no variation? They all had short necks, or they all had short tails, or whatever the example that they give you in an exam. Then you have to tell me what could maybe have happened. So maybe there's a predator, maybe there's a drought, something happened in the environment, and that will then lead to some some consequences. So you'll tell me what they're going to use a lot, if they are using it a lot, or even if they're using something less. For example, if the giraffes are going to use their necks a lot, they're going to stretch their necks. And then you state that this is the law of use and disuse. And then because of the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, this feature will be passed on to their offspring. And then you'll tell me what happens over a long period of time is that all the giraffes will now have longer necks. So this is our basic framework. And I would really suggest that you copy this over into your workbook and then use this framework to apply an example that they give you in a test. So we're going to have a look at how to answer this in a test. We'll use the example of the giraffes, and then we'll also look at a past paper question and exactly again how they use this framework and how they apply it to answer the question. So let's look at a first example. So here we have the example of the giraffes, which is probably what is in your textbooks. And then this is now how you would answer a question based on how Lamarck would explain the giraffe's neck. So you'll start by saying that there's no variation in a population. Then, using the framework, you have to tell me what does this mean in terms of the giraffes. So this means that all giraffes had short necks. Something happened, so maybe all the grass died and the only food that's available is in the higher trees. So that caused them to really stretch their necks a lot because they now need to reach the leaves that are higher in the trees. Then you'll tell me that this is the law of use and disuse, and because of that, their necks will grow longer and longer. Then, because of this law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, their offspring will now have longer necks. So this will be carried over in their genetics. And then what happens over a long period of time, they eventually all have long necks. So you can sort of get the idea that this is a bit of a silly viewpoint of evolution. It doesn't really happen that way. We don't just want to change. We don't have this drive to just stretch our necks and then it just happens. That law of use and disuse, it doesn't really work that way. We have genetics involved, and we need to change our genetics also for it to be passed on to our offspring. So they can also ask you why Lamarck's laws were disproven. So here we have the list in the slides. So Lamarck's theories or his laws were incorrect because your phenotype can't change your phenotype and then that changes your genotype. So if you have done genetics, you'll understand these two terms. So I can't go and change my hair color, my phenotype, and dye it red, and then that changes my genotype. My genes will now altogether just change, and I'll have the alleles for having red hair. I can't paint my nails and now have blue nails, and my genotype will now just change. Things doesn't work like that. And because of that, we say that Lamarck's theories are incorrect. And that these features that I now just acquire, the fact that I'm coloring my hair, that doesn't alter my DNA. And because of that, it can't be inherited. So me changing my hair color to red wouldn't mean that my children will now have a red hair color. So I can't just change my phenotype and then that won't just be passed on to my offspring. And then lastly, also, we don't have this drive to evolve and this drive to change. Like this beaver over here, he can't just wish that he has a chainsaw and try, and then altogether his little paw changes into a chainsaw. It doesn't work like that. We don't have this internal just drive and this sort of way that we just want to change. So if that would have happened, this is sort of what we would see. So if this was the person and he's changed his phenotype, he's built some muscles, he's got a beard, so his phenotype looks like this, and if Lamarck was correct, it would have led to the offspring looking like that. And we know that that is obviously not the case. Our phenotype doesn't affect our genotype, right? Our genotype actually it affects our phenotype. So I can't make changes to my body and then that won't be inherited by my offspring. So the thing that Lamarck was right about was that the environment plays a role in an organism's phenotype. So whether you are building muscle with dumbbells and whether you're building muscle with a log, the environment is going to affect the person's phenotype. But building the muscle isn't necessarily, the sort of larger muscle won't be inherited by the offspring. Right, so looking at an example from a past paper of how they have asked questions about Lamarckism. So they can give you this example of a webbed foot of a duck and ask you how would Lamarck have explained the evolution of ducks with webbed feet if the ancestral ducks did not have webbed feet. So here they're already telling you what the original ducks look like. They didn't have webbed feet. So that is the lack of variation that they have. So from the start, we use our framework, and now we're just going to apply the framework to the given example. So there's no variation, and that means that all ducks had feet with no webs. So that is what they're giving you in the example. Then something happens. Maybe there was a drought, or the ducks that were forced to search for food in the water, and that forced their skin between their toes to really become stretched. So they use that a lot, and that is called the law of use and disuse. And because they're using that piece of tissue a lot, it becomes larger and a bit more developed. And then this feature that they acquired will then be inherited by their offspring. Right, and then over a period of time, all of the offspring will have webbed feet. Right, and then also just this law that you also just need to write down, the law of the inheritance of acquired characteristic. So you can see that following that framework and then just applying it to the given example will really help you to get all the marks necessary. Another question that they can ask you is why Lamarck's explanations is not accepted by most scientists today. So we've covered that quite a lot, and that is the fact that we can't inherit these acquired characteristics, or your phenotypic changes will not be inherited. Or you can also mention that it's only characteristics that are controlled by genes that will be inherited. So that is why Lamarck's theory was discredited. Another quick example of how Lamarck could have explained the evolution of flightless birds. So they're telling you that they are now all flightless. So that means at the start they could fly. So what happened that they now can't fly? So if you think about these two laws, use and disuse, what would they have used their wings a lot, or would they have used their wings very little to now not be able to fly? So they obviously use their wings very little, and then we state this law, the law of use and disuse, and that caused their wings to become a little bit less developed. And then they could not be using them so much for flying. And then because of that law of inheritance of acquired characteristics, this was then passed on to their offspring. All right, so that covers Lamarckism quite extensively. We're going to move over to the next theory, which is the theory of natural selection made by Darwin. And again, I'm going to give you a framework that I really encourage you to write down and to copy. And then that framework can then also be used to with any example that they give you in an examination. All right, so looking at Darwin, he proposed this law of natural selection, and he basically came up with this law after a whole voyage on this HMS Beagle, and he observed many and documented all the information about their geology and their biogeography. And after he returned for about 5 years, he developed his theory. So we'll first look at what he actually observed. So his observations were as follows. He realized that there's quite an overproduction, that in a population, if these are my two parents, they actually produce a whole lot of offspring, and ultimately more offspring then that would actually ultimately survive to adulthood. So some of them, they produce way more than what is needed that will ultimately survive. The next observation was that there's variation, which is quite a great observation in his theory of natural selection, is that there are differences between the offspring. That is one thing that is quite different to Lamarckism, where Lamarck said that they're all looking exactly the same. There's no variation. In this case, he's mentioning that some of them might be red, some of them might be blue, and that they are not all the same. And in the previous chapters that you've discussed, that variation is due to mutations, it's due to meiosis, it's due to random fertilization, and that leads to some of them having a favorable characteristic and some of them not having such a favorable characteristic. The next thing that he realized is the survival of the fittest, or a natural selection. So he realized that some of them are quite, have a feature that makes them a little bit more suited to the environment. And in essence, that helps them to survive. So if this background is now pink, the pink butterfly is a little bit less visible to a predator. Whereas the blue butterfly, they are more visible, they're not so easily to blend in, and therefore they might just be killed. So he said that it's not necessarily survival of the fittest, but it's the survival of those that are most suited to their environment. So those that are most suited, like these pink ones, they will ultimately survive. And those that are less suited, like these blue ones, they are less suited and they will ultimately not survive. The next thing, or the last observation that he made, is that genetics play a role, that these characteristics will be passed on to their offspring. So if the parents has a beneficial characteristic, like having, in this case, having the pink color, if that helps them to blend into the environment, that pink color will be passed on to their offspring, and their offspring will then also have this beneficial feature. Whereas if blue is the unfavorable feature, and they survive, their offspring will also have the blue color feature. But if they don't survive, they won't be able to reproduce to make more blue colored butterflies. So ultimately we'll have more of the pink colored butterflies because they survive and they can reproduce. So that brings us to sort of a definition of natural selection. So that is where nature selects. So nature plays a role. We as sort of humans, we don't play a role in this. Nature selects for those individuals that are best suited, and they will ultimately survive, and they will ultimately produce more offspring. So looking at this example, here we have a chameleon looking for some food, and he spots these few beetles that are quite visible to him. So ultimately, these ones that are the same color as that blend into the leaf, they survive. All right, so they have the beneficial feature, they survive and they reproduce. And then ultimately there'll be more offspring of the green colored beetles than those that are a bit of a darker green that doesn't blend in so much. Another example is an example of these moths that blend into the bark of the trees. So this is quite an interesting example where throughout time different colored moths were benefited from the bark of the trees. You'll see here the bark is quite light, and that happened before pollution and before the Industrial Revolution. So the bark was quite light, and then the darker moths stood out. But through all these fossil fuels being released, the bark actually turned darker, and then the lighter moths were spotted by the predator. Right, so it is about nature. So you can see that yes, the dark moths are sort of hidden, they are blending into the environment, and the environment actually chooses those that will survive. When the bark was light, the lighter colored moth blended in, and he had the most beneficial feature and he survived. So looking at this framework that we're going to work with, so the framework reads as follows. This is what I would advise you to write down. You will start by saying that there's variation, right? So in a population, there's variation, and then you will tell me what this variation looks like. So in terms of the moths, there were white moths and there were a darker colored moth. Or in terms of the giraffes, there were giraffes with long necks, there were giraffes with shorter necks. Right, so you'll just basically use the example that they give you and you'll just put it out there. Tell me that some of the ducks had webbed feet, some of the ducks didn't have webbed feet. Right, so moving on to the next thing, we'll have to say what is happening. So now there's something that happens, there's maybe a drought, there's maybe a new predator, maybe the bark of the tree now looks different due to pollution. Then you'll have to tell me who is best to survive. So the moth that is white will blend in and will survive, for example. And you'll tell me who doesn't survive and why. The one that doesn't blend in, he's more visible and he won't survive. You'll tell me that this is called natural selection, and then you will tell me that this feature will be passed on to the offspring, and after a long time, let's say all the giraffes had long necks. So this is your framework, and now we will look at, I think, 2 examples of how to apply this framework to an example. So it's there's a few of these examples of frameworks that you can use. The one for Lamarckism, the framework for Darwinism or natural selection, and then there's also a framework for speciation that you can, if you have your framework, you can really just apply it to the example. So let's look at our first example, the one with the giraffes again. So how Darwin would have explained the evolution of the giraffes is he would have started by saying that there is variation. Right, then he's going to say some had long necks and others had short necks. So he'll describe the variation. Next up, something happens. There was a drought and only the food high in the trees were able to be reached. The struggle for survival is those with the long necks, they could reach for the food and they could survive. And those with the short necks, they couldn't survive and they died. You'll tell me this is called natural selection. This long neck feature will be passed on to their offspring, and over a long period of time, all the giraffes had long necks. All right, so applying the framework to an example. So the next example that we are looking at with Darwin is an example of the flamingos and their legs. So the question mentions that flamingos are wading birds that can wade into the water in search for food. The longer their legs are, the deeper they can wade into the water. In terms of natural selection, explain why there are more flamingos with long legs than flamingos with short legs. So they are giving you this clue that you have to answer this in terms of natural selection, not in terms of how Lamarck would see this. Lamarck would have a totally different viewpoint, but in terms of natural selection, and you'll see there it's a total of 6 marks. So that 6 marks can really influence your final mark. So using our framework and now just applying it, we'll start by saying there is variation. Next up, we have to basically just state the variation. So some have long legs, others have short legs. Something happens. So the thing that we suspect could happen is maybe there's a shortage of food in the shallow water. So they actually need their longer legs. They actually state this in the question. They need their longer legs to wade for food that are a bit deeper into the water. So obviously those with the longer legs, they are able to survive because they can get the food. And those that have short legs, they would die out. So this is very stating the obvious, but again, following the framework, you can get your maximum marks. And then the long leg flamingos, they will then reproduce and pass this allele or this characteristic on to their offspring. And after a long time, there's a greater proportion of flamingos with longer legs. All right. On my slides, there's another example, which I'm going to skip to the end. I'm just afraid we won't have time. So the third theory of evolution that we're going to discuss is the theory of punctuated equilibrium. So this theory was developed by Stephen Gould, and he actually just added and expanded to Darwin's theory. So he basically said that evolution doesn't happen like this. Evolution doesn't happen gradually. Evolution happens where sometimes there's a long period where there's no change, and sometimes there might be a short period where there's like rapid evolution followed by a long period of no change. So that is Stephen's model, or the model of punctuated equilibrium. And it basically, I'll give you the sort of the rundown of it in words, but they can ask you in terms of these two pictures, which diagram illustrates punctuated equilibrium and why. So this is punctuated equilibrium. This is Darwin's sort of model. And the reason for that is Darwin explains an evolution that shows that there's gradual change. You can see there's a colored butterfly, and gradually it's changing the whole time, or it's changing in that direction. Whereas with punctuated equilibrium, he says that there's only so many sort of like intermediate fossils that we find in the fossil record. So we'll find that butterfly in the fossil record, and we'll find that one and that one. We don't actually find all of these in between ones. Otherwise our fossil record would have showed us a lot more in comparison to what we have in the fossil record. So his explanation for evolution is sometimes there's just a long period of no change, sometimes there's just a rapid evolution followed by a long period again of no change. So here again we have two graphs, and you should be able to tell me which one, the top one or the bottom one, represents, let's say, gradualism, the theory from Darwin, the theory about natural selection, where the species just gradually change, carry on with evolution the entire time. So that is obviously this bottom graph, where you can see that over time evolution is just keeping on happening the entire time. Whereas with the new theory, the theory of punctuated equilibrium, it says that there's evolution. So you can see there's a steep sort of part in the graph. Evolution takes place, followed by a time where there's no evolution, right? There's sort of this constant line in the graph, no evolution, followed by a period where there's evolution, and then a period where there's no evolution. Right, so again, these two, you need to be able to identify which one would represent natural selection, which one would represent punctuated equilibrium. Another example would be this top one versus the bottom one. The top one shows us where this sort of founder species of bird or finch is constantly changing, constantly going through evolution or gradually going through evolution. And if that were the case, then we would have found that species in the fossil record, that species in the fossil record, and that one in the fossil record, which we don't. We don't have so many intermediate fossils that we found in the fossil record. So punctuated equilibrium shows us that there's some change, right? So evolution happened there rapidly. Then there's maybe a long period of no change, followed by change again. So we'll find that one in the fossil record and that one in the fossil record, and not so many. So there's basically less of these in-between species that we find in punctuated equilibrium. So writing this out, we would say that for a long period, there was no change. So there's this long period of no evolution, or we could call this stasis. And then, due to something in the environment changing, there is now a rapid evolution. So a long period of no change, followed by a short period of change. So for a short period of time, there's some evolution happening. And the sort of the evidence that we have for punctuated equilibrium is the fact that there's not so many intermediate fossils. So we don't have so many of them in the fossil record. So we'll quickly apply what we know now to an example from a past paper. So in this question, they have a phylogenetic tree, and it shows evolution by punctuated equilibrium. So there they give you a clue, and they want you to explain what does punctuated equilibrium mean by using these letters A and B. So A, there's this little insect. Would you say A is a long period of change or a short period of evolution? Right, so looking at the answer, A would be a long period. So here it says long period of no change. So a long period of where there's no change. Right, followed by B, which is a short period of change. Right, these alternate with short periods of time where rapid changes occur. Right, so just quickly going back to this, the sort of text about punctuated equilibrium. This is what you need to know about punctuated equilibrium. This is sort of your framework. So with any given question about punctuated equilibrium, you have to know that there's long periods of no change, followed by a short period of change. So that can be applied, if I just go back again, with this question, why would this be punctuated equilibrium? There's a a period of change followed by a period of no change. All right. So by basically using this framework, this is basically what you need to know about the theory about punctuated equilibrium. Right, so grade 12, that brings us to the last part of the work, and that is speciation. So luckily, we have now covered the 3 theories of evolution. We've covered Lamarckism, we've covered natural selection, and we've covered punctuated equilibrium. So the next part of the work of today's lesson is discussing speciation. So with speciation, we first need to understand what is a species. What makes a species? And then secondly, we'll also go through a framework. So I'll also give you a framework of what do you have to say to get your marks in an exam. But then again, you'll have to apply the framework to a certain example. So we'll look at a past paper, we'll look at our framework, and then I believe we're set for the exams. Right, so firstly, what is a species? So a species, I always tell my matrics, there's sort of 3 checklists for something to be defined as a species. Firstly, they need to look similar. Secondly, they need to be able to breed. But those 2 aren't too, it's quite easy to think that they look similar, and a lot of the times they can breed, they can interbreed. But the real, like the crux of the matter is they need to be able to produce offspring that also can produce offspring. So their offspring needs to be fertile. Now I quickly want to test your knowledge with this. So over here we have a situation, 3, let's call them islands, and they are separated, and I want you to tell me which one of these statements best makes sense. So it tells you between A and B, so that's the arrow, between A and B, they can't reproduce. So we can't really see whether they are the same species or not, because they just cannot reproduce. Between B and C, they can reproduce, so that's good, but their offspring is infertile. Right, so that is my 3rd checklist. So because their offspring is infertile, that makes B and C different species. Then looking between these 2 populations, these 2 islands, they can actually produce fertile offspring. So that is fantastic. So that makes population A and population C, makes them the same species. Right, so looking at our options over here, that brings us to B being the correct one. B and C are different species, right, because the offspring is infertile, and A and C being the same species because they can produce fertile offspring. All right, so getting into speciation, the type of speciation in your curriculum is called geographic speciation, and that is because they are separated geographically. So there we have a little fox, and there we have a little fox, and they are physically isolated from one another. They are separated by a river or an ocean. And because of that, it can result in the formation of a new species. So the type of speciation that is due to them being separated from one another geographically, we call that speciation geographic speciation. Alright, so I'm going to tell you a short story, and then we will look at our framework. So the story is as follows. Here we have a population of wild fruit flies, and they are just minding their own business on these rotting bananas. They are laying eggs, and they are just going about their business. And then something happens. There is a tornado or a hurricane, I see in the text, a hurricane, and it washes this bunch of bananas from the mainland, so that was the mainland, and it washes them all the way to a coast of the mainland. So let's just call that an island. All right. So they were on that side. Now they're on this side and they are now separated by the ocean. So if for some other reason these fruit flies would have been able to go over to that side, they would still be able to breed and would still be able to produce fertile offspring. So as of now, these two populations, they are still the same species at the moment. But now, throughout time, the environment might be different. So this is on the island and this is the mainland, the original sort of area where the fruit flies came from. And the environment might be different. There might be some winds. It might be hotter. It might be more or less humid. And because of the environment being a little bit different, they can experience some different selective pressures. And due to maybe different food being available or different courtship displays that could change over time, over many generations, some changes occurred due to natural selection. And the same is happening on our original mainland. So they might be experiencing different environments, different predators that might be present. And due to natural selection, the organism with the most suited trait will then survive and that feature will be carried over to the next generation. So let's say this bunch of bananas from the island, for some other reason, comes back to the mainland. So we meet again, right? So another storm could introduce the island flies to the mainstream again. And then looking at what happens, we'll see that they are not too fond of one another anymore. So they actually just mate with their own sort of species. And if they mate, their eggs might be non-viable or not fertile anymore. And now we can see that if they were to meet again, like here we have the original banana fruit flies and the island fruit flies, they are not mating with one another anymore. So now we can say that now we have a new species. So that was the story of the day. Now I'm going to give you the framework, and then we will apply this framework with a few past paper questions so that you really know that you've got this. So looking at the framework, we'll start by saying that a population is divided into two. And I really want to highlight the fact that you have to start your framework or your giving your answer and start it off by saying that there's a population. If you start with a species is divided into two, you will be penalized further on. So you must start with a population is divided into two. Next up, you have to mention the barrier. So you have to tell me specifically what separates them, because this is about geographical speciation. So there must be some type of barrier, whether that barrier is a river, whether it's a mountain, whether it is strong winds separating one population from another. You have to mention what that barrier is. And usually in the final papers, mentioning that barrier would then be a compulsory mark. So the barrier is always in your question paper. It's always listed in the picture or it is written in the text, but you mentioning that barrier and telling the examiner, this is the barrier that separates the two populations, you'll get 2 marks already for that. Right, so let's carry on with our framework. So now because of that barrier, the two populations, they can't breed anymore. So remember, we had our island fruit flies and the mainland fruit flies, they can't breed anymore. And because of that, there's no gene flow between them, right? each population will undergo natural selection independently because they are going through different environmental conditions. Each population will become genotypically and phenotypically different so that if they were to meet again, they won't be able to breed anymore, and that makes them now two separate species. So this is basically your memo to use in a final or in your prelims or in a test. I'm literally giving you from the exam guidelines the memo that you have to sort of just memorize and study and then apply it to a situation where they're asking you about geographical speciation. The only thing you have to add is you have to mention the barrier. All right, that's the only thing you have to add out of your own that is not, that will be given to you in a situation. So let's look at two examples so that you're sure that you'll get the hang of it. So the first example you might also see in your class. So here we have a population of rabbits, and those arrows shows you that there's gene flow. So that means that they are breeding with one another and their genes are sort of being moved around within this population. Then we'll see there's a river, and that now separates, literally separates population A from population B. So you have to use your framework and literally state the obvious. So population, remember we have to start with population, it's divided into two, and then you mention the barrier. In this case, it's a river. So in every situation, it could be a different barrier, but you have to apply it to this example. The barrier here is a river. Now these two populations, they cannot interbreed anymore. Therefore, there's no gene flow. See there, we had proper gene flow through everyone, but now we can't, there's no gene flow between the two populations. There's only gene flow within each population. So the next thing you have to mention is that each population, this side of the river and that side of the river, they will go through natural selection independently. And that is due to different environments. So maybe this side has a different predator compared to this side of the river, or this side of the river has a different food source compared to that side of the population. You don't have to mention the condition, you just have to use these words because of different environmental conditions. Then they become so different, genotypically and phenotypically, that if they were to meet again, so here we see they meet again, now they will not be able to breed with each other successfully. And that means that they are now two separate species. So now we have species X, or species Y on this side and species X on that side. So looking at our last example of geographical speciation, they mention here in this exam, and you can also see it's 6 marks, eh? It's a lot of marks that you can sort of ace in an exam paper. So a lake was once full of water, and a population of fish were able to move freely throughout the lake. So here we can see the population of fish, and then they mention that a drought caused the level of water in the lake to drop so that the fish population was separated. So you have to mention what the barrier is over there. So there's sort of this strip of land. So many years later it was discovered that speciation had occurred. So now you have to describe the type of speciation that we can see in the diagram. So using your framework, we are now just going to go through this memo. So starting off that this is geographical, due to geographical isolation that occurred, or you can mention that there's this, due to the drought, there's now this land that separates the two populations, or this rocky island that separates the fish into two populations. Again, starting off with population. Next up, there's no gene flow happening between these two populations anymore because they are separated. So they have different environmental conditions. Each one will go through natural selection independently, and they would become genotypically and phenotypically different from one another. And that would prevent them from breeding with one another should they then meet again. So this is, in this case, there were 2 compulsory marks, but this is a very common question that you can expect in an exam. So I would suggest you use these sort of 4 frameworks: the framework for Lamarckism, the framework for natural selection, punctuated equilibrium, and speciation, and really study it and then try to apply it to an example that you've used in class. And I can assure you, if you study these frameworks and apply it, you would get maximum marks in your life sciences paper 2. So these frameworks are actually used very often, and a lot of the papers, they're asking these questions. So grade 12s, I hope you had a fantastic day. I hope you really learned a lot. And that is all from my side. Have a good afternoon.